Hi, I'm Ben April, CTO Farsight at Domain Tools.
And I'm Paul Vixie, the founder of Farsight Security.
Welcome to this week's episode of Reflect and Amplify. We've titled this one The Angle Grinder Paradox. It's a look at the darker side of cloud outages and how we may have lost our way thinking about services rather than overall systems. We'll take a look at some of the recent large-scale global cloud outages and see what we can learn as outsiders from what we know.
So thinking about angle grinders, I'm reminded that all power tools can kill, and you really have to take some care when you're using them. You can't live with them, you can't live without them. But anyway, for this content to be as relevant as it can be, we need input. And so we've created an email address, reflectamplify@farsightsecurity.com, which we hope that you will address yourself to in order to say, hey, it would be kind of interesting to hear, your take on thus and so thing. We really do need to know that. Otherwise, we're going to make stuff up. And also, this is a live program. It's if you're watching this on YouTube, there is a chat window, and we encourage any questions or comments that you have. Go ahead and let fly.
So the angle grinder paradox comes from the idea that as the scope and complexity of a system grows, the likelihood that any one system service failure within that overall system is going to drive you to get in the car, drive somewhere, and bring your power tools in order to recover. There's a relatively recent famous one rumored to involve an angle grinder, but that's not new. I can think back to 4 or 5 times in my career where we've had to make the call that, all right, time to break out the power tools. Software is not going to fix this one. I will note that for the events we're talking about, we're building this mostly on the information that's available publicly. We don't have any special inside knowledge. We weren't there. We weren't part of the teams. We don't have any, secret information. What we do have is many, many years of breaking systems on our own, and some wisdom that comes from doing that.
Yeah, let me add that if we actually knew anything, we would have been prescribed from explaining it here. So we really are speaking from a position of enlightened ignorance and generally goodwill. We're not trying to make anybody look bad. We just think that these events are significant and they can help illuminate different possible futures.
Definitely. And actually, to extend that, we definitely want to applaud and commend the folks who have published some of the high quality after action reports we've seen, detailing and describing what went wrong, how it came to be that sequence of events took place, and how they resolved it. It's an embarrassing place to be, but many of us have or have had in the past engineer in our title, and really a part of the engineering ethos is when something goes wrong, you take those extra steps and spend time and explain to others, make yourself an example. Don't be like me. Don't screw up the way I did.
It's true. That ethos runs strong, and it's about engineering in general, not just what we do here with the ones and zeros. It's kind of fun to look at the after action report for a bridge collapse and look at, we riveted this to that, but we forgot about the stresses from here. And so when this happened, that happened, and it was horrible. Let's never, as human society, none of us ever do that again. You can't get that intelligence without some transparency. So likewise, I applaud those, the people who've been publishing their sort of how-to guide about how the bad thing happened. Fairly often, you'll run into a lawyer somewhere who says, oh no, we can't talk about that. That'll make us look bad. And they don't quite understand, actually, that's what makes you look good.
Very true. It is when I look at outages and when I'm looking for new services, that's one of the things I consider is, have they owned their mistakes?
Yeah.
Everybody has outages. We talk about 4, 5, 9s, and people like to think about 6 9s, but in reality, stuff breaks. And how you address that, how you deal with that, and how you make that not a problem next time is how I evaluate, if I expect you to be a good partner in the future. So,
all right, with that in mind, let's take a look at Facebook's recent outage.
All right, so this was a big one. This was 7 hours for October this year, 2021. The specific sequence of events is a little fuzzy, but from the evaluations I've seen, it really all kind of fell apart when a whole bunch of BGP prefixes fell off the net. The withdrawals started a chain reaction, including taking out DNS, which, as everyone knows, it's always DNS. You get rid of DNS and you start wondering, how do I get to the staff directory to get the phone number of the person I need to go kick the box to fix whatever happened here?
Yeah, uncontrolled growth of dependencies is kind of one of those hidden gotchas. It's wonderful that you can put stuff anywhere and it'll be found everywhere, and yet if you don't model what'll happen if we had an unthinkable BGP outage, then you don't know how your system as a whole is going to behave if you can't reach your own internal systems because the DNS servers that contain the map of where your systems are and what addresses they have is itself not reachable to you. So it turns out there's a lot of necessary bootstrap material, just sort of connective tissue that has to be not automated in order that when terrible, unthinkable things happen, you can still figure out, where you are and who you are and where your coworkers are. And that is a very difficult planning process because you don't know where to start. Well, okay, what if Martians land? Well, wait, that's crazy. Yeah, but the last thing you said, that's crazier.
Yeah, I mean, this goes a step further, and it's rumored to include things like access control. The specific door locks.
That's right.
Yeah, it's one example.
They couldn't get into a data center to reboot a server because the door lock was controlled by the server that was down. That was. I'm sure that Facebook has had a really major sort of rethink about all this, and they're doing everything they can to illuminate their cross dependencies. And all we can hope is that they will publish sort of that process. After they do it, they'll say, this is how hard it was, and now we're trying to keep it up to date after every change control meeting, and this is how hard that is. But, ultimately, those are the real costs. The real TCO, total cost of ownership, of these magical systems includes an awful lot of just scut work.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about, all right, how do I get a hold of these people? In a small organization, you can do what we do. Most of my ops staff has a printout dead tree copy of the staff directory. But as the organization scales, that's not always applicable. It's an interesting security question while you're at it. So, how do you handle, making those connections when things hit the fan?
Yeah, so let's leave Facebook alone for now and focus on Cloudflare next.
All right, so this was a short event, about 27 minutes on 2 July 2019. This is one where I think Cloudflare did a great job writing up what happened and breaking down the process, how it failed, and what they're going to do about it. The short version is a CPU intensive regex string was fed into their web application firewall, consumed all of the CPU of a large number of their cloud platform systems, to the point where it was impossible to get in to remove that rule. Between authentication and performance of the system, they just couldn't get around it, is how it's described.
Well, this is, if you were going to make a cartoon about this, it would be somebody sitting in a tree on a branch, sawing off the branch that they are sitting on, and then they're on the ground with no way to get back. And it highlights that sometimes what you need is a fuzz tester, because this condition with this regex is something that was never going to be found with red teaming. But a random regex generator would probably have been able to discover this, so that even if they didn't fix it, they would know, hey, don't do that. But as systems get more and more complex, it becomes harder and harder to figure out sort of how the combinations and permutations of different bugs, including supply chain bugs or external events, could cause horrible, unrecoverable things to happen. But yeah, it only took a half an hour this time, but it was still global. So,
Yeah.
The fix for this, I believe, is what they did, which was total transparency. And there are a lot of super competent people inside of Cloudflare, and their hands are not tied. They get to talk about their mistakes, or how they learned difficult things. And so what I'm hoping is that this example will serve history by letting everybody see what will happen if they don't pay attention to the growing costs of sort of combinatorial complexity.
I think it's also important to think about services versus systems, right? So we think about these individual components, DNS, BGP, these building blocks that you stack up, but then you put, say, your DNS servers on a cloud platform that you share with your, LDAP or access and authentication systems. And when one of these systems, takes out the core, takes out the capability of the other systems on that same platform to operate, how do you bootstrap your way back in?
The thinking in the cloud industry is all around what you said. It's focus on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to provide, and just let the automation take care of how what you're trying to do maps to physical infrastructure.
Right.
But it turns out that internal thinking, we kind of have to avoid that and do something we would not advise our customers to do, which is to actually think about where things are and what version they're running and what switch they're connected to, and figure out what the common mode failures would be. Anyway, enough about Cloudflare. Let's talk about Google.
All right. So this one, about 4 hours. Same time frame. Month before, 2nd of June, 2019. This was an interesting one. If you go read, maybe we'll put these in the put the links to these in the comments, or in the description. It was a sequence of automated changes where the coordination process, at the same time the changes were rolling out, took down the controller necessary to update those changes. So an error rolled out, but as part of that process, it actually deprovisioned the process that would roll out the dependency or the replacement for that change if something had gone wrong. So this kind of leans into change control and change management, and how do you implement that in a world where you're trying to automate everything in order to function really at all. So it looks like Vixie disappeared. We will give him a moment and see if he can reconnect. Oh, here he comes.
Hi, I'm back.
You're back. Cool.
Did I mention that all power tools can kill? Please go on.
I was just saying that the change control and change management, the lack of plotting out what elements were involved in a specific change and what would be necessary to resurrect from an error in that path were in play.
Again, I can't imagine a red team coming up with this scenario. It's too outlandish. They would come up with what if Martians land before they would have come up with this.
Right.
So, we're doing what we always do, which is talking about stuff that's of great interest to us. But I want to move us along as well. So, even though your brother works there, we got to talk about Akamai.
Yeah, you do. So this one, 22 July, 2021, about half an hour. In this particular case, the DNS Edge platform took out a whole list of, well-known services, including financial, gaming, logistics and shipping, a bunch of gig economy stuff, and some big ones, Amazon, Google, etc. It's not just your products and services that have the potential to be unaccessible during one of these events. You've also got to consider the collateral damage.
Certainly, if Akamai had needed FedEx to deliver something in order to get out of this outage, they would have been in a bad position because FedEx was affected by the outage, as well as Steam and Airbnb and certain parts of Amazon and Google. And what this shows, again, is the seductive lure of systems that work well, right? You can tell how good Akamai is by how rare these outages are and how many other people are therefore ready to say, this might be important. Let's host it with Akamai because they're really, really reliable. And then, of course, there comes along an exception that proves the rule. It's always somebody's turn in the barrel. And so it's, I think, important to resist that lure and say, no matter how good they are, we need more than one. And we need to test periodically. We need to induce a failure in one, even though that could potentially, out us and put our name in the headlines. But we have to know what happens when one of these things goes down, and we'd rather do it at a time of our own choosing, and then later we'll do it to the other one. That way of thinking will add nines to your sigma.
Yep. Yeah. When I think about writing up these after actions, I'd much rather have it be self-inflicted testing that we are actually reliable than I would have it be a failure. I'll jump back to Facebook for a second. It's also worth thinking about the collateral damage. Maybe it's not just the services themselves that had an issue, but in the case of Facebook, when their DNS wasn't available, DNS servers the world over got the snot beaten out of them trying to get to Facebook.com and Instagram and hundreds of thousands of times a second.
When something that important and that central and part of that many dependency graphs goes down, everything melts. So it means the rest of us have somehow got to be prepared for an outage that we have no knowledge of. We can't predict. We don't know which of our supply chains depends on it, but we know that there are things out there somewhere, other people's networks, other people's systems, which if they have a bad day, we're going to have a bad day.
Well, that's another one, the circular dependencies that you don't know about. So, are all of my vendors using DNS from the same upstream vendor? Are they all using the same, supply chain element somewhere in the chain? What happens if, you're back to a SolarWinds type scenario? It's like, you've got it's essentially impossible at this point to know all of the vendors, all of your vendors use and how they interrelate to each other.
Right, which is why are the choices we can make, besides auditing your vendors and asking them, hey, where does your fiber run? I got to make sure that a single backhoe doesn't take out all of my circuits. You might just say, well, who do you use for various services? And because we need to find a second provider of what you do who does not depend on the same things you depend on. And that's industrial era thinking. That is not digital era thinking, but it's going to have to be, or we're not going to get much further. So, since we are a lot focused on DNS, that's the way we named this is that DNS gets used for a lot of reflection and amplification attacks. Um, let's go back to Cloudflare and talk about a DNS outage that they had. And again, I'm not picking on them. They were incredibly transparent about what happened and what they did about it. And hyper competent people there. Nevertheless, they have shown up twice in our survey of headline making outages.
All right, so this one was short, about 10 minutes, detected on 21 March 2019. Again, they did a nice write-up here. This was a DNSSEC outage. So most of their platform worked fine, but there were a large number of DNSSEC signed domains that suddenly stopped working if you were validating DNSSEC. That's a whole episode. We could probably do a series on issues with DNSSEC, but the fact that it was a short outage, 10 minutes or less, is actually to me a good sign of the level of monitoring and availability that Cloudflare tracks here, because I know plenty of environments where a multi-day DNSSEC outage wouldn't have been noticed.
Well, part of this modern DevOps era is the idea that you should do A/B testing on a change. And, so you can imagine that Cloudflare as a CDN has got web proxy software that they develop and that they do, an awful lot of testing on, and regression testing and system level testing and stress testing. But at some point, they got to put it in the data path. They got to let real customer traffic depend on it. And I haven't talked to them. I don't know this for sure, but what I feel sure that they do is to say, all right, let's put this in front of a small number of customers and then measure the log files that we get out of those clusters and see how it's going. And if it's okay, then we'll add more and more and more. But they don't just sort of flip the switch. Well, let's install version.next and hope all goes well. And so that type of thinking, I think, in addition to just having redundancy in all of your supply chains, that type of thinking should apply to all of your infrastructure, not just the stuff customers use, but every single thing you do. And the fact that it was only 10 minutes long makes me think that perhaps that's what was happening, is that this was A/B testing and they ran into a problem and they backed it out. And that's probably the speed with which they can put something in and take something out. That's the Planck length in time of a single A/B test. But hopefully these stories are going to influence our listeners to sort of start thinking that way and start saying, terrible things happen and you can't predict them, and so you just have to be pretty conservative in what you deploy. Don't just not deploy on a Friday. Be careful about what you're deploying and how in the first place, no matter whether it's Friday.
I was going to say, so you've got some examples. Netflix famously has their Chaos Monkey platform, which just randomly shuts systems down. And ideally, if you get an environment that reliant and reliable, who cares if you're deploying on Friday? The system's going to take care of it for you.
That is gutsy.
It is.
I was, 20 years ago, the CTO of a publicly traded company. And, we ran a global network and we had customers and data centers all over the place. And I wanted to do stuff like this. And I made the mistake of asking permission. If you ask permission, there's going to be a lot of people who talk about, well, we would have to tell the shareholders that's coming, and I don't want to do that. And if you do find something, we would have to tell the press what happened, and I don't want to do that. So, the hat, I wish I was wearing a hat so I could take it off to Netflix, because they're publicly traded, but they get to behave this way. So that's a huge change. And I'm sure that it started out with a huge fight.
Hopefully.
So anyway, you mentioned a hard copy staff directory,
Mhm.
and I think you were intending that to sound absurd, but it doesn't sound absurd to me. Back when I used to operate things in this company, I had a list like that that was actually taped with, transparent clear Scotch tape taped to the wall next to my telephone. Yes, I had a telephone. Um, Nowadays, it's most likely that in an outage, your phone's not going to work because it
Mhm.
relies on voice over IP. And yeah, you've got a cell phone for backup, but you have no idea what their supply chain is. And so it's very possible that having that list won't help you, but it's at least better to have a list you can't use than to not even have a list you can't use.
Absolutely.
So that should not, by the time you're done listening to this, that kind of thing should not sound absurd. Um, what other sort of near absurdities could we leave them with?
Hmm. I think the other thing I will mention is, I see a lot of, large scale environments where machine learning is a key element in how things are operated. Um, and as absurd as it sounds, sometimes you really ought to have a human check some of these things over. Sure, maybe you don't have to check everything, but hey, I'm about to withdraw all of our routes. Are you sure you want me to do that? Things like that are basic steps.
That can work really well, and it's something that's part of military training doctrine is that you will often have a human in that loop, and you'll have both a senior and a junior, so
Mm-hmm.
that this can be a way to bring somebody up to the level where they're able to sit in that chair by themselves. And we badly need that in our industry because we are inventing new science as we go, and there isn't a sense in which we've done something like this in prior eras. And so we need things like what you just said, partly as a way to make sure that the organization knows what it knows and knows what it doesn't know and know who knows it and who doesn't know it and how they could learn it. So listen, we're down to the wire here on time, and I wanted to say something. A lot has changed since episode 1, and that's one of the reasons episode 2 is late, is that Farsight Security has been acquired by Domain Tools. And that took a long time, and it was kept Ben and I very busy behind the scenes. But it ended with the transaction on November 2nd. And so there will be probably some changes coming to Reflect and Amplify. But so far, it's green light all the way. We are expected to continue it, and so we will. And so, just so you know, that has happened, but I don't think it's going to change anything here.
Sounds good.
Now, are there any YouTube chat things that we should try to get to in the final minute?
Nope. All right. Okay, it's time to get back to work. Thank you for joining us today.
It's been great. This is one of my favorite things to do. So let's get on with it.
All right. So let's. And we're out. Good. Yep.